Good evening, everyone. My name is Courtney Smith. I'm the lead organizer with Unite here in Chicago, and I'm also a member of the Black Leadership Group. Today, August 6, 2020, we celebrate the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. Today marks a tremendous moment in American history where Black people won the fundamental right to vote. As we celebrate, we should also remember how we arrived to this point, how winning the right to vote was a long and hard and at times violent struggle. It was leaders like John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer and thousands of activists, organizers, and just regular working people that marched, protested, and took to the streets day after day for years that led us to this victory 55 years ago. So how did we come to this point? How did the Voting Rights Act come to be? First, I want to say that for Black Americans, the right to vote has been under attack ever since it was achieved. After the Civil War and the end of slavery, the 15th Amendment established that the right of citizens to vote cannot be denied because of race. During the time of Reconstruction, Black men voted, ran for office, and held elect positions throughout the South. Seeing the rise of the Black voting power and Black people's participation in the democratic process, the racist stronghold in the South began to react. Simply put, Black people were getting too much power in the South. As Reconstruction ended, whites in states like Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi suppressed Black voting power by using violence, lynching, terror, economic retaliation, and Jim Crow laws, including poll taxes and literacy tests. These repressive and violent tactics continued for decades, well into the 20th century. By 1940, only 3% of eligible African American voters in the South were registered to vote. In 1962, a little more than 5% of Black folks in Mississippi were registered to vote. Then comes the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. One of the key demands in the fight to the Civil Rights Movement was power at the ballot box. In 1964, civil rights activists and young people organized the Freedom Summer Project to register Black voters in Mississippi and to confront Jim Crow voter suppression. The late Congressman John Lewis, who was the chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wrote that the objective of the Freedom Summer was to force a showdown between the local and federal government. From June to August of 1964 alone, police arrested more than 1,000 protesters, and local segregationists murdered 3 freedom workers, assaulted over 80 activists, opened fire on demonstrators over 35 times, and set fire to 35 churches. This all came to a head in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965, a day we know as Bloody Sunday, where 600 marchers were attacked and beaten by the police on their way to Montgomery to protest both the Denial of Voting Rights Act and the death of a young Black man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was murdered by police. This caught the attention of the nation and tugged on the moral fabric of our country. Millions of people tuned into their nightly news in their living rooms to watch hundreds of young people and regular working people, Black and white, being beaten and killed by law enforcement. Congress had to act. 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act was passed. The Voting Rights Act enforced the 15th Amendment by banning any practices that denied citizens the right to vote based on race, including literacy tests, banning intimidation, threats, and coercion against people for voting, giving the federal government power to appoint examiners to enforce the law, and requiring states and jurisdictions with a history of discrimination to get pre-approval in federal court before changing voting rules. By the end of that year, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered. 4 years later, Black voter registration rates had surged from 35% to 65%. But let's not be fooled. Attacks on voting rights have never stopped. Since the 2010 midterm elections, Republicans have introduced hundreds of harsh measures, making it harder to vote. Since 2010, 25 states have enacted new voting restrictions. 15 states have more restrictive voter IDs, including 6 states with strict photo ID requirements. 12 make it harder to register and stay registered. 10 make it harder to vote early or absentee. 3 states make it harder to restore voting rights for people with past convictions. Between 2012 and 2018, at least 1,688 polling places have been closed in places that were previously covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, because those places had a history of discrimination against Black voters. In Georgia, when Republican Brian Kemp was Secretary of State, before and during his race for governor against Stacey Abrams, he canceled 1.4 million voter registrations between 2012 and 2018 and blocked 53,000 new voter registrations for not having an exact match with other information on file. Right now, Florida is blocking hundreds and thousands of people from voting. Many of them are Black and are poor. Let us be extremely clear. This is a poll tax. One of the ways that states have restricted voting rights is taking them away from people who've been convicted of crimes. In 2016, these laws denied the right to vote to over 6 million people nationwide, and 1/3 of them were African American. In 2018, through organizing by several coalitions, people with felony convictions won the right to vote in Florida. In response, the Republican lawmakers sought to limit this victory by passing a law that mandated all court-related fees and fines and restitutions must be paid in order to vote. This summer, in July, the Supreme Court declined to intervene, allowing this change to stay in place. As a result, 774,000 people have lost the right to vote. Let us be extremely clear. This is a modern-day poll tax. Our work is not done, and I cannot stress this enough. If we are going to beat Trump, we have to go vote. Our ancestors fought tooth and nail, put their lives on the line for our rights, and it's our duty to honor them. It's going to be tough. There's a lot of hate out there. There's going to be a lot of dirty tricks when it comes to the election day, but we will overcome, just like we have done for generations and generations before.